What if the boy everyone overlooks, the one who carries a scuffed backpack and keeps his head down while his mother mops marble floors, knows more words for truth than the powerful man at the top has ever learned for lies? I keep thinking about that question because it's the kind that hooks you by the collar and refuses to let go. And if you're anything like me, you've seen rooms where power announces itself with glass walls and city views, while brilliance walks in quietly, hoping not to be noticed until it absolutely must. That afternoon, the elevator in the Al Rashid Capitol Tower whispered upward through floors scented with money. Ruth Monroe stood beside her son, 14-year-old Elias, trying to make herself smaller. She had a rag tucked into her waistband, a spray bottle in one hand, and the other hand resting lightly on her boy's shoulder like a promise she couldn't afford to break. Ruth had made a mistake bringing him. She knew it. But the after-school program had closed early, the neighbor was on night shift, and when rent is due, you don't risk the job that pays it. The doors opened on a penthouse office carved out of sunlight and arrogance. Karim al-Rashid, oil magnate, Forbes cover regular, patron saint of unblinking confidence, sat behind a desk so white it almost glowed. His cufflinks caught the light as if even they had stock options. He didn't look up at first. People with the world on speed dial rarely do. Ruth set down her bucket, ready to move like the minutes were already late. "Sir, I'll finish quickly." "My son will sit in the break room." Karim's gaze flicked up, grazing over the boy and returning to his screen with the same interest you'd offer a muted TV in a waiting room. "Fine. Keep him silent." "I have calls." Elias stood at the window, watching the city stagger and glitter under a pale winter sun. He looked like any other kid at first glance. Too thin wrists, shoes that had fought with the sidewalk and lost, a backpack patched from the inside with dental floss. But his eyes were steady, the way I've seen chess players study a board after their opponent boasts about a trap that isn't there. You should know this about Elias. He carried language the way some people carry faith. Karim's phone buzzed. He switched to speaker and Arabic filled the room, fluent and fast. Even if you don't speak it, you can hear when a conversation sours. The investor's tone tightened. Karim's replies sharpened, then stumbled, and the call ended with diplomatic pleasantries that only made the silence heavier. "Idiots," he hissed in English now. "When they don't understand, they blame the contract." He noticed Ruth for the first time as a person rather than a service. "Do not touch the conference table today. It smudges." "Yes, sir," Ruth said. She didn't look at him again. She had taught herself to stare at reflections in polished surfaces, never faces. You learn these strategies when your dignity has to fit between the spray bottle and the rag. Elias turned from the window, pulse ticking under his skin. "Sir," he said, carefully respectful, "if I may, on the call, when you said Mubashir to indicate urgency, they likely heard broadcast rather than immediate. The nuance is tricky." The room didn't gasp. Rooms like this don't. They cool. Karim's eyebrow lifted. Amusement, annoyance, the twin mood of men who don't expect interruptions from people without titles. "You caught that, did you?" "Yes," Elias said. Also, the deadline phrase sounded like muraha, which can read as leeway, not a firm date. Karim laughed then, the short, theatrical kind you use to remind a hierarchy it's still standing. "And what are you, boy? My compliance officer?" Ruth flinched. "Eli, don't. Please." "I'm sorry," Elias said, but his voice didn't apologize. It carried something else. Calm, the kind that doesn't need permission. He set his backpack on the edge of the window bench and spoke again. This time in Arabic, classical and clean. Vowels balanced the way a calligrapher balances ink. "If you wish, sir, I can explain the misunderstanding in their dialect." The laugh died so fast it left a shape in the air where it had been. Karim's chair creaked. This wasn't tourist phrasebook Arabic. This was architecture, grammar that fit together with the confidence of domes and arches. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, no humor now. "The Bronx Public Library," Elias said, "and nights online. Some from a tutor I don't pay. YouTube, I've been in rooms where that line becomes a punchline. This wasn't one." Karim stood, a man suddenly unsure whether the ground under his shoes had always been there. "Say something else." Elias did, switching registers, then swapped to Levantine with the ease of someone changing trains. He carried on for a minute, explaining how a single misused verb can make a promise sound optional. Kareem's face did that thing men's faces do when a mirror they didn't ask for appears uninvited. Then Elias pivoted to French, soft and river bright, to German, clipped and exact, to Portuguese, warm as a kitchen at 5 p.m., to Russian, consonants knocking like knuckles on oak, to Mandarin, tones rising and dropping like a string pulled taut and then released, to Italian, vowels turning like coins in light, and back to English, steady as a lighthouse. 9, Elias said simply. I speak 9. Ruth swallowed. She had heard him before, of course. At the small linoleum table at home, his voice moving through languages while the rice simmered and the laundry clicked in the old machine. But here, in a room built to decide the price of other people's time, the sound was different. It wasn't a trick now. It was a declaration. Kareem reached for scorn and found it had gone wherever laughter had gone. He tried skepticism. Anyone can memorize. That isn't fluency. I agree, Elias said. So I brought proof. He unzipped the backpack and slid out a folder thick with patient, stubborn work. Public library certificates stamped with seals that look official because they are. Placement exam reports from a community college program that had taken him because he asked, then kept him because he stayed ahead of the syllabus. A letter from a linguistics professor whose office hours Elias had attended on Zoom until she started asking him to explain things back to her class, because he did it better than the textbook. Kareem skimmed, then read, then reread. The brain loves data when it can use it to dismiss people. It hates data when it must reorganize its prejudice instead. How old are you? He asked. 14. And you think because you can parrot verb tables, you understand business? Elias's mouth did a half smile that reminded me of chess again. The moment before a move reveals what the game has been about all along. No, I think because I can listen, I understand people. That line lodged somewhere behind Kareem's ribs. The truth is, people who rise fast often start to imagine that understanding runs in one direction, upward. They forget that those who serve them learn their rhythms, their habits, their blind spots. That afternoon, the mirror arrived and refused to leave. Why are you here? He asked the boy, genuinely curious for the first time. Elias glanced at his mother. Ruth's hand trembled around the spray bottle. She nodded, risk accepted, whatever came next. Because yesterday, he said, your call with Samir Holdings almost failed. The wording you used created doubt about penalties. If you call back within the hour and clarify with the right phrase, Lisa Fahimaruna, you'll salvage it. They want a sign. They just want to know you mean what you say. Kareem stared at him, and somewhere beneath the practiced scorn, something like respect flickered. You were listening? I was cleaning the hallway outside your conference room, Elias said. Your voice carries. Ruth flushed. I told him to keep his head down. She said it the way you say, I told him not to breathe too loud, which in their world is almost the same instruction. Show me, Kareem said. Elias pulled a worn tablet from the backpack. He'd saved clips, notes, timestamps, evidence stitched together by a mind that understood how power leaves fingerprints when it thinks the door is closed. He had also drafted an email in Arabic that bridged the gap Kareem had opened. It wasn't perfect. It was better. Better because it was precise. Better because it assumed the other side's intelligence rather than pandering to it. Better because it listened before it spoke. Kareem read the draft 3 times. On the 4th, he stopped being offended and started being impressed. If this works, boy, what do you want? Ruth stiffened. She had learned how questions like that are often traps disguised as benevolence. Elias, however, had not come unprepared to the top floor of a glass building. 3 things, he said. A promotion for my mother to facility supervisor with an $80,000 salary and benefits you actually intend to honor. A scholarship fund through our local library for kids like me who can study but can't pay, and a junior language consultant role for me after school and on weekends. You think you can bargain with me? Kareem asked, finding the edge in his voice again, the one that had bought out rivals and charmed regulators. I think I can offer you a deal that pays for itself by the end of the quarter, Elias said, and it wasn't cocky. It was plain. He slid out a second document, an analysis he'd built by reading public communications, press releases, and translated investor summaries. Where phrases had been sloppy, he'd circled them. Where meaning had drifted, he'd annotated. Where contracts had cooled without closing, he'd traced the chill back to a word that had arrived in the wrong suit. I'm not exaggerating when I say the kid drew a map from arrogance to attrition and marked every off-ramp. Kareem felt something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fear yet, and it wasn't shame. It was the moment before both, when the brain senses a reordering coming and looks for a way to delay it. He chose deflection. And if I say no? Elias reached into the bag one more time and placed a small digital recorder on the desk. His voice stayed calm because nerves have a hard time standing up inside a spine that knows it is right. Then I'll ask the Department of Labor and a few journalists to listen to a hallway conversation from last week where you called black employees a risk for leadership roles and told your VP you prefer to promote men who look like you because optics are simpler. New York is one-party consent, sir. Ruth made a small sound, half fear, half apology. She hadn't raised her son to threaten. But I need you to understand this. Some threats are simply the truth arriving with documentation. Kareem's jaw muscles jumped. He remembered the conversation. He remembered the swagger in the words, the lazy certainty of not having to justify them to anyone who mattered. He had forgotten that people who matter vacuum at 9:40 p.m. while executives wait for a town car. You're blackmailing me, he said. I'm offering you a second chance with receipts, Elias replied. And I'll be clear, if you sign and honor what you sign, the recorder stays with me, buried in a desk drawer next to algebra homework. If you don't, it learns to walk. For a full 20 seconds, no one spoke. There are different silences in the world. Some are rest, some are refusal. This was the silence that happens when a door you didn't know existed opens onto a room you didn't think you'd ever have to walk through. Kareem sat. He read the mother's promotion letter, the scholarship fund outline, the job offer draft. He read the clauses about retaliation and about audits and about library oversight. The boy had thought through the angles, where power wriggles when you try to pin it, and how to say no to the wriggle with language it can't misinterpret. He signed. Ruth didn't cheer. People like her have learned to move gratitude through their hands, through work, because loud thank yous make the wrong people nervous. But her eyes shone in a way no cleaning solvent could dull. Elias shook Kareem's hand. I'll send the email now. You should call 5 minutes after it lands, he said. Apologies sound stronger when they travel in pairs. Kareem nodded, still reassembling himself. He had not been a good man an hour ago. He was not yet a better one. But if grace is a classroom, then humility is attendance, and he had finally shown up. As for me, yes, a narrator earns the right to speak here. I keep coming back to that first question. What if the boy everyone overlooked knew more words for truth than the man at the top had ever learned for lies? That day, in a room whose windows pretended the city existed to be looked at, truth spoke 9 languages, and power for once listened. The first call went out in Arabic and returned in relief. Kareem followed Elias's draft almost exactly, and when he didn't, Elias lifted a hand, 2 fingers, quiet, like a conductor saving a symphony from a wrong entrance. Precision did its work the way precision always does. Less like a miracle, more like a door clicked shut against draft and noise. The investors signed the following afternoon, not because they were charmed, but because they were convinced. That difference matters. Charm evaporates, conviction writes checks. Ruth's promotion triggered HR emails that moved like reluctant furniture. Forms arrived, meetings happened. People who had never learned her name started saying it with the upward lilt of sudden respect. Miss Monroe, they called, as if the syllables gave them clean hands. Respect is a language too. It's just one a lot of offices don't speak fluently. Elias reported to a conference room repurposed as a war room. Contracts taped to glass, timelines pinned with colored string, a whiteboard divided into columns that he'd labeled meaning, tone, and risk. He didn't posture. He analyzed. He listened to recordings of negotiations and translated back to English not just the words but the posture inside them. Confidence disguised as courtesy, suspicion painted as professionalism. The exact moment when a perhaps means we're out unless you offer the right bridge at the right time. He built a small team out of overlooked people. Fatima from legal, whose gift for nuance had been wasted writing disclaimers no one read. Luis from facilities, who spoke Spanish, Portuguese, and the grammar of human impatience. May from procurement, whose Mandarin could move a negotiation from stalemate to tea in 15 minutes flat. And Ruth, not because she needed inclusion points added to someone's dashboard, but because after 5 years on those floors, she could map a culture by how it stacked its chairs after meetings. People think language is just words. It's also choreography. Within 3 months, the scholarship fund was public. It lived at the library, not the company, because Elias insisted on oversight that could say no to corporate vanity projects. Kids arrived after school with hunger in their eyes. The kind food can help, but only opportunity can satisfy. Some came for language, others for calculus, others for the quiet. The quiet was new. In homes where silence is only available after exhaustion, a quiet room with good light becomes a cathedral. Kareem visited the library on a Thursday with cameras because that's what men like him do when they've decided to become philanthropists. If this were a lesser story, I'd tell you he cried in public and the internet forgave him. But this isn't that kind of tale. He didn't cry. He watched. Elias stood in a circle teaching a threading exercise. How to carry a phrase from one language into another without tearing it. How to keep its shape while letting it dress differently. Karim listened. He recognized the older version of himself in a boy who asked too loudly if any of this even matters if nobody hires you. He recognized the exiled version of himself in a girl who sat at the back and took notes in perfect cursive while pretending she wasn't deciding whether to trust any adult in the room. Afterward, Kareem approached the librarian, a woman named Dell, who understood precisely how to orchestrate a room where poor kids become future problems only in the sense that they problematize prejudice. "Does he always run it like this?" he asked, nodding toward Elias. "Like what?" Dell said, playing dumb in the way wise people do to make the powerful say the thing they're almost ready to learn. "Like, a conversation," Kareem said, surprising himself a little. "Yes," Dell said, because he remembers what it feels like not to be heard. Kareem looked at the bulletin board. The scholarship application was printed in 6 languages. The info session schedule listed evenings and Saturdays, because low-income genius often works a shift. The bottom of the flyer carried a line that had been Elias's insistence. Selection based on curiosity, grit, and proof of effort, not on grades alone. He knew how report cards can measure chaos at home rather than capacity in the mind. Back at the tower, news of Ruth's promotion stirred exactly the reactions you'd expect. Some people congratulated because they meant it. Others congratulated because HR had taught them the face you make while you resent quietly. A few said nothing and waited for failure, like people who bring folding chairs to parades so they can sit when the applause passes them by. Ruth navigated it the way she'd navigated humiliation for years, by choosing the next right task over the last wrong comment. She audited schedules, rewrote vendor contracts, and, in one small but telling act, replaced the break room coffee with something that didn't taste like burned regret. When a junior analyst mocked the change, Ruth didn't flinch. "Good coffee says, we think the people who work here are people," she said, and went back to the inventory sheet. It wasn't all victory, of course. Nothing true is. A week after the scholarship launch, a blogger published a post calling Elias a PR stunt and the fund a gilded conscience scrub. The article racked up shares among people who enjoy being cynical because it costs less than being informed. Elias read it and sat very still. 14-year-olds aren't built for the public's appetite. Kareem saw the post too. The older version of himself, the pre-library, pre-mirror version, would have ignored it or called legal. Instead, he walked to the war room and found Elias tracing a sentence in Russian with his finger the way some people trace scars. "Do I talk to them?" the boy asked. "You keep working," Kareem said, "and we show them." He didn't add that he had said worse things privately than anything that blog would print publicly. Redemption is heavy. It wants to live in sentences where you admit the prices you paid were, in fact, other people's. The biggest challenge came from inside. Power rarely leaves without trying to set a fire on the way out. One vice president, Robert Chon, who had sat beside Kareem on that elevator and agreed too easily with prejudice, found ways to slow-walk approvals, to question Elias's recommendations with compliments shaped like concerns. "It's impressive, certainly," he said in meetings, "but perhaps we're moving too fast on governance for a teenager's ideas." The room would nod. Careers nod by reflex, and then look to Kareem. Here's where leadership mattered, not in public announcements, but in the small transfers of authority that signal what a culture is learning. Kareem didn't deliver a rousing speech. He delivered a decision. Elias's team has veto authority on cross-language contracts. Final review flows through them. It was a sentence that pushed air into different lungs. Some people inhaled opportunity, some inhaled fury. At home, Ruth posted the promotion letter on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a mango. She let herself take the long way past it each morning because joy should get to strut. After dinner, Elias worked until midnight some nights, then fell asleep face down in a grammar exercise, the light pooling around him like permission. He kept the recorder in his desk drawer as promised. He didn't threaten again. He didn't need to. Real leverage, once demonstrated, starts to live rent-free in the memory of the powerful. And still, underneath the movement, in the meetings and the mended contracts, something waited. You could feel it in the way Elias sometimes stopped mid-sentence, as if listening for a sound only he could hear. You could see it in Kareem's pauses, the ones that appeared when he watched Ruth sign documents with a pen the company had bought, rather than one she carried from home. There was history here that hadn't been named, a thread tugging across years. I didn't know it then, but the boy who spoke 9 languages had learned a 10th, the dialect of secrets, and he had one more door to open. Permit me a brief reflection, because part of telling this story responsibly is admitting the lesson that kept unfolding for me while I watched it. If you want to understand who a person is becoming, don't look at their victories. Watch what they do with their power the first time it arrives. Ruth used hers to stock the supply closet fairly and to make sure the night crew got the same safety gear as the day crew. Elias used his to teach other kids everything he knew for free. Kareem was learning, and learning is not a headline. It's a practice. 6 months turned to 7, and the library wall filled with certificates, names scrawled in markers that bled through thin paper. Amina, who nailed the subjunctive in Spanish like a gymnast, sticking a landing. Carlo, whose Portuguese turned a Brazilian vendor from wary to warm in 2 calls. Joy, whose Mandarin tones found confidence at last. The fund paid for exam fees and bus passes, and a laptop that 3 siblings shared on a schedule taped above their microwave. Progress is not always photogenic. Often it looks like a small calendar with boxes checked in pencil. Al Rashid Capital's numbers responded, not spectacularly at first, then unmistakably. Deals that had stalled moved forward. A Japanese partner who'd kept an elegant distance sent a gift of tea with a handwritten note. May translated it while smiling with her eyes. A Middle Eastern consortium that had once treated Kareem with grudging respect now treated him with collegiality. Not because he'd bought a better suit of humility, but because he'd started saying exactly what he meant in a language they didn't have to translate around. The media arrived late, as it often does, the way spring shows up after someone else has already weeded the garden. Forbes asked for a profile. Kareem agreed on one condition, that they photograph him at the library, not the tower. The reporter blinked, then agreed, drawn by the novelty of a billionaire, in a room where the carpet had been patched by volunteers. During that interview, the reporter turned to Elias. "What would you say to kids watching this who feel invisible?" Elias thought, then answered with the careful honesty of a person who refuses to give platitudes to children who've already survived them. "You are invisible to people who can't be bothered to see. That's different from not existing. Learn the difference and don't confuse one person's blindness with your worth. Also, save your receipts." He tapped the folder of certificates and recommendations. It was a joke. It wasn't a joke. After the cameras left, Elias asked Kareem to stay. They sat at a round table that had once supported 1,000 paperbacks and now held the weight of a conversation that would pry open a decade. Elias set 2 objects between them, a thin envelope, yellowed at the edges, and a photograph, black and white, the kind that seals memory into grain. "I found these when I was researching you," he said. "I didn't bring them before, because I wasn't sure if the timing would serve truth or just drama. Kareem's fingers hovered. He didn't touch the photo yet. What is this? A letter from a Beirut schoolmaster to an American sponsor, Elias said, and a picture of a boy in a uniform 3 sizes too big. Kareem picked up the photo. A boy stared back, barefoot, narrow-shouldered, chin set like a dare no one had accepted yet. The eyes were his. Kareem blinked and the past rearranged itself around a real artifact instead of the sanitized story he'd told to investors when they wanted grit without the mess. He lifted the envelope and slid out a page written in looping Arabic script. Elias translated softly as Kareem read. The schoolmaster described a student named Kareem, bright and stubborn, who learned faster than the class could accommodate and who needed a scholarship to continue. The letter explained that the boy's father had disappeared, that his mother cleaned houses and sent him to school with whatever coins remained, that he talked back when adults confused wealth with intelligence, that what he needed was a door. It was you, Elias said gently, not accusing. Everyone tells a story like you did it alone. But someone wrote a letter. Someone opened a fund. Someone made a bet Kareem didn't speak for a long time. Then he did, and his voice sounded like a man hearing the real version of his life read back to him by a witness he hadn't paid. I forgot, he said. No, I edited. I kept the parts that suited me and mislaid the rest, Elias nodded. People call what I did that first day blackmail. It wasn't. It was restoration. I asked you to remember what you already knew. That talent is everywhere, and the only thing rare is the will to see it. He slid a second paper across the table, a draft endowment agreement to make the library fund permanent, governed by a board that included students, not just donors. You once were the kid who needed a stranger's pen. Be that pen, Kareem smiled, the kind that lifts without performance. You're frightening, he said, but now he meant wise. Do you ever think about being a lawyer? I think about being useful, Elias said. Titles are geography, not purpose. Ruth joined them then, still in her work shoes because good news doesn't make you float. People just say it does when they haven't worn those shoes. She placed a hand on her son's shoulder and another on the table like she was steadying them both. May I say something? She asked. Because people who've had their permission taken learn the habit of asking it back. Please, Kareem said. I spent years teaching my boy to be quiet, Ruth said, eyes bright. Not because I believed silence was noble, but because I thought it was safe. I was wrong. Safe is what you build when you make men like him listen. She squeezed Elias's shoulder. I will never teach a child to be smaller for a room again. Kareem signed the endowment. The librarian cried. Kareem did not. That's not a criticism. We keep imagining redemption as public weeping, when often it's just adults doing the paperwork that should have been done in the first place. The board formed, the fund grew, the blog that had called the whole thing a stunt published a grudging update that felt like a non-apology from a cousin at Thanksgiving. Elias didn't gloat. He had too much homework. There were missteps. Of course there were. A new manager tried to sideline Ruth by reassigning her to a strategic oversight role that came with a window but without authority. Ruth walked into Kareem's office and laid out, in bullet point clarity and paragraph grace, the difference between optics and outcomes. The reassignment vanished. A donor tried to steer the fund toward naming rights for a wing that didn't need a name, but did need more outlets and better Wi-Fi. The board, half teenagers with tongues sharp enough to slice platitudes into ribbons, voted the naming scheme down in under 3 minutes. At 15, Elias sat in on a Tokyo negotiation and translated both language and posture so precisely that a 6-month impasse melted into a signed memorandum by lunch. On the drive back, Kareem looked at him and said, You saved my company. Elias shook his head. We saved our people. The company learned from that. The Forbes profile landed. The photo showed Kareem seated at a library table, Ruth standing behind him with a badge that read, Facility Supervisor, and Elias at the whiteboard, halfway through sketching how one verb in Mandarin has 4 fates and how each fate can lose you a partner if you get cocky. The headline could have been worse. It could have been better. That's journalism. The comment section did what comment sections do. Then it moved on. If this were a fairy tale, I would end here with a moral embroidered in gold thread. But life prefers cotton. Sturdy, washable, honest. What I can tell you is this. Months later, at a scholarship ceremony, a girl named Sana gave a speech about how it feels to become visible and how terrifying that can be when you've learned to live inside walls made of other people's lower expectations. She paused, glanced at Elias, and said, "Thank you for seeing me in a language I didn't know how to speak yet." The room applauded the way rooms do when they're full of people whose clapping used to be reserved for other people's children. After the ceremony, a shy boy lingered near the refreshments, like hope pretending it wasn't hungry. Elias approached him the way a person who has learned 9 words for welcome approaches a door. "You thinking about applying?" he asked. The boy shrugged. "I don't think I'm the kind." "Everybody is the kind," Elias said. "We make a new category for every kid who walks in." The boy laughed, unconvinced but willing to be convinced. He took a form. That's how change often begins. Not in press releases, but in a paper form lifted by a hand that wasn't sure it should reach. Now I'll give you my own small commentary. The kind people sometimes tuck into the end of a video because they know you've stayed with them this far and earned it. I used to believe language was mostly about grammar and accent, about the ways vowels bend under different skies. Watching this unfold, I changed my mind. Language is really about who gets to be named as capable, about which lives we conjugate in the future tense. Elias spoke 9 languages. But what stunned an Arab millionaire on a winter afternoon and kept stunning him all year was that the boy also spoke the grammar of justice. He knew how to decline a lie. He knew how to conjugate a system into something like mercy. He knew how to turn a sentence that used to end in period into one that ends in possibility. And if you want the short version, the one you can carry into your next meeting or your next argument with yourself about whether you deserve to be here, take this. When power finally listens, fluency sounds like truth. If this story found you at exactly the moment you needed to hear that you are not invisible, leave a globe in the comments and tell me which language, any language, you dream of learning next. I'll be reading. And yes, I'll save the receipts.